Hi, I'm Chris.
Oh, am I going now? All right. I'm Mark.
And welcome to another episode of
Tank Talk.
Tank Talk.
With Mark and Chris.
With Mark and Chris. And today we're wearing t-shirts from a great company called
Dog Tag.
See, I prompt him every time. He's the, delivery guy. Dog Tag. They provided these shirts to us and really like them. His has got P40s, my favorite. Mine is called Mad Cat. Please check out their website. We'll have it posted in the, that's right, in the comment or the information section below. Today we're going to talk about French tanks.
And
the
British tanks.
And British tanks.
And German tanks.
And you're going to learn what BEF stands for. Not right now. Hold the suspense. So, let's start with France's entry into World War II. Mark? Okay, that was them. So
I guess the larger picture of what we're going to talk about today is what's leading up to the evacuation at Dunkirk. And the tanks that were involved in that, the tank battles that were involved in that, some of the strategies and tactics that were involved in that, all fascinating stuff because it's just, these are the opening acts of the Second World War in Europe, at least for the Allies, to be involved in. A little bit of backstory, because you know I like to do that.
a little bit.
A little bit?
Okay.
After World War I.
Because, I have to edit all this, and it's a royal pain in the chops.
Yeah, but you do it so well. Okay, so
After
World War I, France did not want to be invaded by Germany again. So they built a little fence they called the Maginot Line along the border of France and had to stop at Belgium because Belgium was neutral.
And the thing with, if I may, the thing with Belgium was, because they claimed they were neutral, they told France, no, you can't build a wall here. And they had the full expectation that Germany would respect their neutrality and not invade. Yeah,
Anyways,
that worked out.
So, but the French were like, okay, that's cool. We got our Maginot Line up to here, but then across the border is the Ardennes Forest and the Meuse River. Ain't no way Germans getting past that because they're still using World War I style tanks and they won't fit on those roads.
Yeah, the roads actually going through the Ardennes were a very small, narrow, just like fire roads, if you're familiar with those. There was no paved roads whatsoever, and it was very rugged terrain. And France believed this up until they did a what?
Well, funny thing,
they're still laughing about it today.
in retrospect anyways, March of 1940, the French military commissioned a report, a analysis of a German advance to the Maginot Line and or through the Ardennes Forest, fully expecting it to show that everything the French have done is perfect and we're good to go, France is safe.
None shall pass. What? None shall pass.
What the report actually found was that the Germans would get through the Ardennes Forest and across the Meuse in 60 hours.
60?
60.
Okay.
So they, in their infinite wisdom, said, okay, we should probably keep this to ourselves because it would be really bad for morale.
You didn't see anything, right?
Yeah. But don't be prepared, just make sure you feel good about it.
Right. I mean, picture a big giant carpet and a broom. Sweeping it under the carpet. May of 1940, and the Germans start their shenanigans in France. And
was the report accurate?
well, I'll tell you how that worked out, Chris. I mean, it actually wasn't accurate because the Germans actually got through the Ardennes and across the Meuse in 57 hours. So German efficiency, what are you going to do? But
Okay.
then that led to the second battle of Sedan, because there was a battle of Sedan during World War One, where you had the first clash of tanks on the Western Front.
Now we're getting into the realm of the tanks, and these are the early tanks of World War II. So the Germans had
The Panzer II, III, and IV. They also had some Czech-made light tanks. They had those big old long German words that we abbreviate to STGK.
which we're not going to cover in
T-35,
depth here.
yeah, but they had those, and they were, little. So the primary tanks were the Panzer II, III, and IV.
And so the Panzer II was actually just an autocannon.
Two autocannons.
Two autocannons. Now, was that the 20 millimeter?
20 millimeter autocannon, I think.
Now, the Panzer IV still had the short, low velocity,
50?
I think 50
I think it
millimeter.
was a 50.
We'll put a correction down right there,
As is our custom.
and let you know if that's correct. But they were fast assault tanks, and they were relying on the Blitzkrieg in order to get through. A lot of people think, oh, Blitzkrieg, that's what the Germans invented. But in point of fact, they were not. They took that strategy from...
Well, you said Romans. I
Right.
said General William T. Sherman and the American Civil War. Now, both are correct. One is for ancient times, one is for modern warfare. Sherman came up with the concept of a war of maneuver. Instead of a static line, you're attacking quickly. And whether the Germans actually took that from him or not, or developed it on their own, we'd have to look into.
Yeah, we'd have to ask some of the Germans involved in. So on the...
They're mostly dead.
On the... Mostly. On the Allies side, there was the British Matilda II, the British Matilda II, Samoa S-35, and the S stands for Samoa, so it was the Samoa S-35, and the F...
Those French are very specific.
They are. And the FCM-36. Let's touch briefly on the Samoa S-35, because I know all of you are ready to hear about this tank.
It was a major tank. I can't even finish that. No.
No, but for its time, it was one of the best armored. The Germans couldn't penetrate the armor. Now, this is considered a light tank. It was
It was a medium tank.
Was it a medium?
It was a medium tank, yeah.
Correction below.
Right, got it.
So this was a medium tank. It was a 4-part cast hull, and it had 47 millimeter in the front armor. It also had a 47 millimeter gun, which hit pretty good.
Yes, and the both the French and the British tanks, the Matilda II, were very well armored for the time. I mean, the Matilda II had what one report I read said it was the best armored vehicle at that stage of the war. The Matilda II carried a 2-pounder, which was, I think, around a 40 millimeter cannon. So again, dealing with the German tanks one-on-one, the French and the British tanks were superior.
It's interesting that you bring that up. First of all, for the FCM...
I'm interesting just overall.
I've known that for years.
Right?
For the FCM-36, because it was so work-intensive to build, there was very few of them made. Whereas because the Samoa S-35 was a cast hull, they made a lot of those. Unfortunately, they lost a lot of battles, and the Germans ended up capturing about 297 of them.
This was the bulk of them.
Yeah. The FCM-36 was built by a shipbuilding company. I'll put the name down below because I can't pronounce it.
Was that why they called them land ships?
Okay, sure.
We'll go with that.
And but the problem was that they were expensive to put together because they were welded. It took more manpower. It took longer to do. So the French decided to approach this with a frugal sort of mindset.
Yeah, but you got to admit that a welded tank is a better quality tank than a riveted tank.
It is, but they made them very small. As a matter of fact, they only had two-man crews because it was just after World War I, or relatively close to it, and France was short on two things: money and men.
Why do you think that was?
Well, probably because most of the men had died.
And they spent a lot of money.
And they spent a lot of money
trying to defeat the Germans the first time around.
So in the FCM 36, you had a driver who was actually sitting quite crunched up in the front, and he had a very narrow view slit. And then you had the tank commander, and the tank commander was also the gunner. He was also the loader. So every time the cupola was large
crowded
enough.
turret, isn't it?
Oh yeah,
There's two guys. There's a lot going on in there.
He'd actually have to come down out of the turret, go get a shell, and then come back up, put it in, and then he had a very narrow slit.
So the guy below couldn't just hand it to him?
No, because he's driving.
Are they union?
I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, look into that, because I think there's a differentiation of jobs.
And the other drawback with the FCM 36 was that it had a rear hatch, meaning
Where'd they put that?
in the rear
Really?
of the turret.
Wow.
So there was no cupola. There was no way for the tank commander to just stick his head out, look around. He had to look through these very, very narrow slits. And imagine you're in this tank, rumbling along, shaking, and you're looking
Radio
here,
blast
then
and
to here,
AC
then
on.
to there.
Yeah.
So it was a huge drawback. But the Germans couldn't penetrate their armor.
Because they had good armor. And then they had not good guns.
The French didn't have radios.
Sidebar.
Sidebar.
The way that the Germans found that they could combat these tanks was they had an anti-aircraft gun that was 88 millimeters. The famous 88
The
millimeters.
famous 88.
So they would say, well, that's a good gun that we can use. So they'd lower the anti-aircraft guns and shoot tanks with it. This is a darn good idea.
This is a great idea.
We should use these more.
Maybe we should put these on a tank.
What the heck?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's where we started using the 88s, because they would take out tanks.
Now, much like in the American Revolution, the British were still of the mind of using very old tactics where they just walked out in a line, they would stand there, and they would, fire away.
With the British tanks, they didn't have red coats on them, did they?
They did not.
Did the British tank commanders wear tricorn hats?
Maybe. If I find a picture of one, I'll put it up. The French, their tactics were very much stuck back in the days of World War One.
Both of them were. I mean, the British, I feel, one man's opinion, were more adaptive to what was going on, but the French were just like, no, this is how we fight, and France was overrun in six weeks.
You're asking yourself, how could the Germans have beaten the French when the Germans' tanks were inferior to the French?
Well, I'm going to say tactics.
Exactly. The German tactics were more adaptive and flexible. And so whereas the French would say, this is how we're going to do it, and that's it, and there's no discussion.
And you'd better play along by our rules.
The Germans said, how about if we all just ignore all the other tanks, all the other enemy, we'll select one at a time like a pack of lions.
A wolf pack? Perhaps?
Oh, very nice.
There you go.
And then bring that French tank down, and then we'll move on to the next. And as Mark pointed out,
while taking losses, but still you're overcoming it. It's like chopping down a tree.
I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay. I sleep all night, I work all day.
It's like boom, 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 boom. We're going to take them out one at a time. And the French, I think you're starting to say about the radios. Not all the French tanks had radios.
too expensive.
Yeah, a lot of money there going.
So to coordinate a tank battle when your tank commander is basically busy loading and shooting, telling the driver where to go, and trying to peek out these, and coordinate with other tanks, it was impossible.
So the French invented multitasking. They didn't do very well at it. So they had these Battle of Sedan, and then there was the Battle of Arias, I think,
Which one was that?
after Sedan.
Okay.
So, but there are both times the British and the French are trying to blunt the Germans from advancing. The Germans outflank them, get around them, and then we start to see the enclosure around Dunkirk.
The predominant tanks of the Battle of Sedan were the Panzer III and the FCM 36.
Panzer III was a good tank.
A really good tank.
It's just, but you know, as I said, you can see these generational changes. But at that point, they had the nexus of what was going to be the Panzer Corps for the German army, well armored, for the time, well gunned, and very mobile and fast. I mean, the British Matilda and the Samoa 35 were built as infantry tanks. They weren't fast, they were well armored. Interesting to note about both of them is that they had armored skirts over their wheels, which is something that kind of disappeared into the war and then reappeared later on.
And as Mark pointed out, the Samoa S-35 was built as an infantry support vehicle. It wasn't fast for that very reason.
Yeah, a top speed of like, what, 15 miles an hour?
Something.
Flat out, downhill.
With somebody behind it pushing
Right,
it.
pushing
yeah.
it.
They wanted that tank to move at the same speed as the infantry.
Of course, if you've got infantry guys running at 16 miles an hour, that's good infantry.
The Germans thought, hey, this isn't a really bad tank. They just didn't, French didn't know how to use it. So all of the
Which is
captured
a fair
tanks,
assessment.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
really was.
So the Germans repainted the Samoa S-35, slapped their insignia on it, and then when France fell, they paraded all of the captured French tanks down the middle of Paris.
It's a giant middle finger to the French. It really is. But, it's like, okay, thanks for the tanks. We're going to go now use them.
And they did, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. They actually ended up, there was a few, not many, but a few actually ended up on the Eastern Front fighting the Russians. I don't think they lasted long, but they were there. But the Germans did that a lot with captured equipment, especially early on in the war. There was rebranded French and British tanks that the Germans put into use. They even rebranded Shermans, but that's a different story.
I've always thought, how nervous would you be as a tank commander inside of a captured enemy tank, even though it's painted? If all they see is the silhouette, you don't know if your own people are going to put an 88 millimeter shell through you.
And you know that your guys could shoot through those tanks pretty easily.
Like that.
Like that, yeah.
So eventually, when the fight came to Dunkirk, the French have been maligned a lot that they surrendered easily and that kind of thing. But in point of fact, they made up the bulk of the resistance, holding back the Germans.
They're the ones who manned the salient that was around Dunkirk that allowed the British to evacuate.
Most of the French were captured. And it was a huge sacrifice to save the British Army.
Do you know that the British, for Dunkirk, Operation Dynamo as they called it, they were hoping to only evacuate 35 to 40,000 troops. They ended up evacuating 336,000 troops. So that just speaks to the magnitude of the effort that they put into. So hats off to the French, I mean, honestly, for doing that.
If you've seen the movie Dunkirk, you get the wrong impression that the little ships were, in point of fact, responsible for most of the evacuation. And that's not really true. And as a matter of fact, some of those little ships, they weren't even piloted by the owners. The Royal Navy showed up and said, if the captain happened to be there,
We're going to borrow your boat.
we're going to borrow your boat. And if
it
the
may
captain
come back with holes in it.
if the captain wasn't there, then it's just like, yeah, we're taking this boat.
Right, because they left the keys in it. Or you look in the visor and the keys will just drop down.
Yeah, that's.
But yeah, there was, I think, I don't remember the actual numbers, but the little ships evacuated, in the thousands of people off the beaches were the Royal Navy, but some of the other larger merchant ships were the ones responsible for evacuating the bulk of and here's what we promised you, the British Expeditionary Force.
The WWII.
There was also a strategy in play to preserve the Air Force and the Navy. That's why the Navy wasn't bringing in a lot of Royal Navy ships for the evacuation, because they were getting bombed, they were getting sunk, and they needed to preserve that in case of the cross-channel invasion. Same with the RAF. They needed to try to hold on to those planes because they weren't producing as many as they were losing. Because taking this a step further, had the British been captured at Dunkirk, that was the bulk of the British Army. What would have been left to defend Britain had the Germans mounted a cross-channel invasion?
A whole lot of nothing. And as a matter of fact, the loss on the loss of equipment on the British side was just breathtaking.
They can get the people off. They couldn't get the equipment off. So the amount of material that they left on the beaches was, they're like, okay, well, so we can fight, but we don't have anything to fight with.
Artillery, tanks, we're talking thousands upon thousands.
Rifles.
Rifles, even rifles. I don't understand why. Ammunition. It was so bad that once the army returned back to England, they actually had to go into salvage yards and get old school buses and old trucks and stuff that had been scrapped and get them running just so that they had some form of transportation.
Just to move people around the country. They had an army, but the equipment was gone. So after that, they started really ramping up production because they had to.
Yeah, it really says something for the English spirit.
At that time, I mean, June of 1940, okay, so you've got your army back across the channel. Britain is defended by an army, but they don't know what's looming just on the other side of the channel. They just got beat by the Germans. They've shown that the Luftwaffe was a force to be reckoned with, that the Wehrmacht was a force to be reckoned with. What are they going to do? So then we go into the Battle of Britain, but that's probably going to be another talk.
When you think about the opening actions of World War II, in the grand scheme of things, it's really a wonder that Germany didn't win. They were, tactic-wise, they outdid us, and in many ways their equipment outdid us. But it was the failing of their leadership that ultimately brought them down.
And the failing of production. They couldn't keep up. Once America entered the war, they could not keep up with the production. As FDR said, the arsenal of democracy. They had a lot going for them, but a lot of failings as well.
Yep, very true. So I think...
You know what? There's so much more that we can branch off into, and we're kind of holding back, springing off into this, but as closing, just some perspective for this time. This is in May of 1940. Remember, the war had just started in September of 39, 8 months before. So as we've alluded to several times, these were the opening acts of the war. This was still the players, if you want to use a stage analogy, are still kind of dancing around the stage, getting to know one another. But this set the tone for what was to come. And again, bearing in mind, 1940, America didn't get into the war until December 1941. We didn't actually start getting boots on the ground until August of 42. So think about how long Britain stood alone against the Nazis.
Yeah, that was, they had the single advantage of the English Channel, and that was their barrier. But had they been landlocked to the rest of Europe, I think it would have been a done deal.
Had Germany had that cross-channel capability, they were developing it, but the difference in World War II and World War I is that the French made a quick exit. So the British were literally standing alone against these because the French were no longer a going concern.
Exactly.
For them.
So when was it, just as we're wrapping up, I have one question. So when did British troops actually land back on the shores of Europe?
Well, if you want to define Europe as Italy, that was 1943 was the next time that we opened up a true second front. Because remember, we started the war in Africa and fought the Germans there, but by the time that we got back to Europe proper was, as Winston Churchill called it, the soft underbelly of Europe. We invaded Sicily, and then we invaded Italy, which drew troops that the Germans had earmarked for the Eastern Front. Suddenly Hitler's got to say, well, now we've got to draw troops down here to fight them, because the Italians bowed out. So the Italians were like, yeah, we're done.
By the way, whatever happened to Belgium? You know, they were neutral and they totally expected everybody to respect their borders.
They were overrun and they were occupied until liberated in 1945.
Just understand,
44.
when there's a
Yeah.
war and somebody says they're neutral, what that means is they're up for grabs.
Unless you're Sweden or Switzerland.
Yeah. Then, well, especially if you've got all the money. You've got everybody's money.
Right. But that's a whole different
That's a
thing.
whole story.
That's a whole different one there.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us on Tank Talk. Once again, I'm Chris.
I'm Mark. These are dog tags.
Dog tag shirts. Check them out in the comments or in the information section below. They're a good group of guys, and I think you'll like their products.
Let us know what you want us to talk about next. We're open to any and all ideas.
That's right. So I think that's it. Please hit the like button, which is going to be one of these places.
I'm going to say here,
I like it. Hit the comment button.
which I'm going to say is going to be over there.
Now I've got to put it over there. And the subscribe button. That's the important one.
I have no idea where that's going to go.
I have no idea, but I'm sure that the viewers will tell us where we can put it.
And on that note,
Thanks again. We'll see you later.
thank you.